Welcome to Asset Leadership Network Thursday at 4. Thank you all for being here on this August 13th, 2020. I'm Nick Kanoki, the producer of ALN Th at 4, where every Thursday at 4 p.m. Eastern, we put a light on important and relevant asset leadership and asset management topics. One note before we begin, I'd just like to thank all our organizational members shown here. And now, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Mike Bordenero and Richard Culbertson.
Thank you, Nick. Nick is also our technical director, and he makes our lives much easier. So thanks for all that you do, Nick.
No problem.
And it's my pleasure to be chatting today with Rich Culbertson. I've gotten to know Rich pretty closely in the 7 years that I've been involved with the Asset Leadership Network. And you can see on the next slide that Rich is very active. He is an ALN board member. He is a senior fellow.
Sorry about that, Mike.
That's okay. And he is chair of ASTM E53, which feeds into ISO 55000, as does the ANSI. He's a delegate to ISO 55000. He's a former asset management expert from Lockheed Martin, and he is one of the most well-versed persons I know on not only standards, but the effective use of standards. His knowledge of government yellow books and green books and all kinds of interlocking systems, and it's just impressive. So Rich, let's not go into your past because there's so much. Can you just tell us a little bit about what you're doing with the management standards work? You're very effective. Oh, and Steve Holland from LMI just noted that Rich is also a genuine, all-around nice guy. So
great.
We can add that to your title also.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate that. I'll return the compliment sometime. I've been involved in standards and also involved in formation of regulations and comments to regulations for a long time. For regulations, probably since the early 90s. All through that, the 90s, I worked on certain government regulations, some FAR rewrites a few times. Then 20 years ago, there was an arrangement between ASTM and National Property Management Association. And that was the introduction to the creation of standards. And with that, we've been involved in standards for a long time. With that, guiding principle standards, the terminology standards, and a whole range of good standards for property asset management.
What are you doing now?
Well, follow onto that, the ASTM standards, that in 2010, there's an effort to create an ISO standard of asset management. In 2010, we met at ASTM headquarters in Conshohocken, Pennsylvania.
So Rich, let me emphasize now. What are you doing currently?
Oh, you mean the things I do? Well, first of all, I participate in ALN E53. But I'm also in asset management myself. I have a real estate business where my son and I, we buy, we fix, we rent and lease out properties. And we do that primarily in Pennsylvania, but I also have stuff in California that keeps me busy as well. So sometimes when I'm not doing this, I'm building assets, my own assets.
Yeah. And as the chair of ASTM E53, what are you doing?
Well, we have about 30 different standards with ASTM E53. And we just had a very, very large ballot and a lot of success in those ballots of going through. And they're very useful, particularly for folks in the United States, also for government contractors as well as the U.S. government. A wider range of things, actually how to manage property assets. Anywhere from tagging, the movement, to the criteria of what is an asset, again, the guiding principles, how to dispose of assets. There's a whole range of concerning the life cycle of assets. And we try to do is be relevant and to both a government property perspective, but also a company property perspective.
Okay, and you were involved in writing ISO 55000 and are involved in updates to 55001 and 2, and you were involved in 55011. Yeah, so you're very involved. But what we have come together to talk about is asset management disasters. And Nick, if you can go to the next slide. This is very serious subject because it frequently involves fatalities, but we are convinced that through proper asset management, we can help reduce the amount of disasters that come from asset management and mismanagement. We'll be talking about a number of things, but we wanted to show that what we'll be focusing on is the PG&E story, which Rich knows very well because of this article in the Wall Street Journal, and he's been following that. So these are our opinions that we're going to be expressing and not necessarily that of the ALN. And we can turn off the slides and just start talking. So Rich, we're going to focus on PG&E, but let's talk about something current. And there was just a recent gas explosion in Baltimore. What do you know about that?
Actually, it's known very little. What we do know, there was an explosion like either yesterday or the day before yesterday. So far, 2 people killed, and it looks like 3 townhouses were blown up, and I mean the bricks are to the ground. There were people buried there. There were multiple people who were injured. Some are still in critical conditions. I think it harmed like 200 houses. The Baltimore Gas and Electric, they believe that something happened beyond their delivery. But it's very suspicious in that usually there's a gas line that goes from the main to a service line to like a customer service line to the customer plumbing of some sort. So that's a straight line. So it's awfully difficult to figure out how could happen simultaneously with 3 roadhouses. Now, because just a little bit about gas, which is kind of interesting, is that there's how gas works. Is that first of all, gas is lighter than air. So when gas is released into a home, it tries to escape through the ceiling, get the house. So sometimes if you see a gas explosion, you may see it blow the roof off, maybe not the basement, but if you have the door shut, then everything can explode. Gas can only explode if there's between 5 and 15% gas to air. So it's either too lean or too rich. So it has to be, the perfect conditions must exist. So we'll eventually probably find out to be able to see what in fact happened, because right now all you have is rubble. And so the evidence that happened may not be present.
It was a gas explosion in California, a fatal gas explosion that got PG&E interested in ISO 55000, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. There was the San Bruno explosion, and that was with a transmission line, huge line that was handling pounds per square inch, like 400 pounds per square inch, very, very high pressure. And it was they got confused whether there's an extruded line or a welded line. The records weren't quite proper, and they also they had some issues with their test procedures. And also sometimes when you do testing, you can also do destructive testing. What they're normally supposed to do is test it at operating, but if that expands to large amounts, then that can in fact be destructive testing, and that weakens lines, and eventually when stress occurs, then those lines can break and such.
And
California
then, and then what did they do because of the disaster?
well, first of all, it killed like 8 people in San Bruno. And this happened around 2010 or so. And it caused tremendous disaster. I think also the follow-up of that, I think, was also bankruptcy of PG&E. And so it burned down several blocks. And it's easy to find out if you look at.
So what did PG&E do as a corrective action?
Well, they did a couple things. They tried to go through their procedures and such. They also tried to get well. They adopted, ISO 55000 eventually. They also adopted ISO 9000.
Why would they do that?
Well, first of all, on the quality side, that ISO 9000 is a very good international standard concerning how to have your quality organization, which means how do you write your procedures? Are there procedures in accordance with laws and regulations? And are those procedures available to people? Are they updated on a regular basis? Are reviewed? Do they have a proper person who has approved them, who's accountable for the procedures? And also that what should occur there, how do you achieve objectives through those procedures? And so they adopted, again, ISO 5000, ISO 9000. They were also involved in an industry group that created what's called API Recommended Practice 1173, which has to do with pipeline safety systems. You can look that up on the web. It's a very good document, API 1173. But it also, that document, PG&E was involved in it, as well as a lot of the other leading gas utilities were involved in the creation of API 1173. And it also is very similar to some other management system standards that it requires conformance testing. And like
so the effect of following these standards and actually participating in a consensus group to improve standards has an effect on the public. What do you think that effect is on the public?
It's the same thing that happens with ASTM and ISO standards, where you have a group of experts, and these are experts, and they're called experts, and they talk, they gather, they vet standards, they try to have the best standard they can that is useful to the public. And during that process, they test one another, as to the knowledge of what is the best idea. So you have what's a cumulative best ideas of those of the leaders in industry. And so when you take a look at those standards, that's the product of those groups. And again, that happens with API 1173. It also happens with all the ASTM 53 standards, but also happens with the ISO standards we've involved in.
So
on the ISOs,
it gives the public a reason to trust them again, because their processes resulted in a disaster, and in order to regain public trust, they publicly go through this process to help explain that they are now doing things that.
Yes, there should be some sort of assurance. And, a lot of us are familiar with assurance that it happens, through public accounting firms, that companies are required to have internal controls over financial reporting. And that results in some sort of assurance that the public can look at that review by the public accounting firm and rely that based upon their review of the books and records of that particular company, that what the company is stating publicly has been confirmed through inspection and testing and sampling.
And so they did this asset management process and compliance, but they
now what happens
necessarily
with that is that, matter of fact, PG&E did in fact go through ISO 55000 and were certified through ISO 55000. They had an external company that looked at their processes. One thing, you know, about the article that is in there is that when PG&E was asked, did they want the electric side to go through ISO 55000? Because ISO 55000 could apply to all portions of their company, but they chose to limit it to the gas portion. Now, since they've adopted ISO 55000, I think that was finally approved like in 2015. I haven't read any more explosions from PG&E, but what you saw in the slide was what happened with PG&E, where they had these fires, where a hook somehow broke. You know, you had a piece of equipment that's like 100 years old, and it somehow broke. A live wire fell to the ground and started a fire, maybe two fires. Ultimately, what happened with that is that there were 84 people who died in those fires in 2018 in California. And the president of PG&E just a few months ago pled guilty to involuntary manslaughter on 84 counts. Right now, they're in bankruptcy. And they haven't, I don't believe they've come out through that yet. But basically, they bet on the company by having bad policies and actions on things that which they didn't know or should have known.
Yeah. So that's really an unfortunate example of why asset management, good asset management practices are really important. You're also familiar with another gas explosion that.
What happens with companies, and of course, a lot of companies, there's a lot of good folks in the companies, but sometimes there are situations where they're compartmentalized, they're siloed, that one side cannot communicate to the other properly, and so they may not necessarily be seeking out weaknesses of their overall system. As a result, things happened even though people knew they were weak, but did not do anything to correct those weaknesses. And so for gas industry, what 1173 did, it requires a system, just like ISO 9000 required a system of corrective action requests. And they would be tracked and somebody be accountable to correct those issues. And then that would remain open as a corrective action until in fact completed. Those types of systems can help companies to recognize weaknesses and correct those weaknesses. However, if companies don't have that system, and if the culture does not allow for prompt action, then that creates weaknesses for all, and that's how disasters occur.
So that's a good lead in to your personal experience with the gas company that had a disaster in Boston, but they also provide gas in Pennsylvania. And why don't you talk a little bit about what happened in Boston and then talk about your personal.
One piece of property I purchased, it was a fairly new property. It was built in like mid-50s, and nice house. But the person happened to be on one of these programs that reverse mortgage. When the person died, it wasn't picked up, and therefore it went through foreclosure. And so it was empty for about 2 years. And so when I bought the property, I asked for the gas to be turned on, and the gas company told me, well, we can't turn our gas because we abandoned your line. Now, a lot of us in property management, we understand abandonment, particularly if we're involved in the government property arena. You know that a government contractor, for example, cannot abandon government property. The only person who can abandon government property is the official from the government, plant clearance office or something of the like. And so in abandonment, the only person who can abandon property is the owner. Well, they claimed they had abandoned my property. And I said, well, you can't do that. Well, we did. So Then they asked me to go ahead and replace it at my own cost. Well, that started a conflict, and I appealed that up through their management all the way up to the CEO and CFO of the corporation, and eventually even to the board of directors. They didn't back up. They required me to replace my line, and if I didn't do that, I wouldn't get gas. I eventually took them to small claims court. There in small claims court, they claimed that the jurisdiction of the small claims court could not adjudicate it because it had to go through the Public Utilities Commission. So I lost that. Took it down to the Common Pleas Court. Same thing happened. Interesting enough, though, is that the Public Utilities Commission doesn't have authority to provide judgments for private individuals. So they essentially misrepresented their authority to those courts. So I've been involved hanging with the Public Utilities Commission on my case since May of 2017. Here again, these things, when you think of delays, delays can cause problems. Delays can cause procrastination, regardless, and cause continued harm to people.
And what was it that happened in Boston?
Well, so what happened is that here again, you have companies that when they're on the wrong track as far as how they correct their own problems, how they do their own procedures, how the culture itself can cause the problems can just wait to happen. For example, one of the things that I noticed in my situation, I noticed that one day they were using uncalibrated equipment. Well, they were supposed to use calibrated equipment, but just didn't. That companies are supposed to use things like lockout, tagout. A lot of times that occurs and it's required in OSHA. You see it in electricity, but it all occurs in all type of energy sources, so that that things are controlled. So everybody knows that you can't interfere with something that's locked out, and if you do, it causes problems. They had a lockout tag problem in Boston, and they also had a situation where they had they're supposed to have pressure limiting devices, and what happened with that is that most of these gas lines, they operate at 0.5 psi. Well, a lot of times they have regulators on them that may be coming in at 9 psi or whatever, and the regulator takes it down to 0.5 psi. Well, and they were upgrading some lines, but they didn't realize is that their lockout tagout procedure wasn't working properly. So eventually what happened is that they put through 9 psi into homes that were designed for 0.5 psi. And that impacted appliances, and it caused leaks within those homes. And when it did that, there were multiple homes that exploded in fires. And it greatly impacted around the Merrimack Valley in Massachusetts. That particular company, however, they started doing the emergency, and the governor of Massachusetts decided they weren't doing it properly, and therefore he put another utility for the cleanup process. Eventually, what happened is that the company did plead guilty to Pipeline Safety Act violations, and they were required to pay fines of $53 million. I think the state wants them like another $54 million in fines.
And Rich,
they were required to sell the company. So they got expelled.
So, and these are just the gas asset management disasters. As we know, Minnesota, the bridge fell, and as Jim Dieter has said, our bridges aren't falling down because we don't know how to maintain bridges. Our bridges are falling down because leadership is not empowering the people to do the jobs that they know they should be doing. So I think these disaster stories are a call for leaders to adopt the processes that will help prevent them. So,
Absolutely. And what ISO 55000 does, it makes folks go through a property management plan, a strategic property management plan, and again, they should be looking, and that should be broad, so that they address the risk and opportunities associated with their particular business, and so they are able to take advantage of the opportunities, but at the same time, make sure that risks are also considered and minimized.
Excellent. So let's check with Nick to see if we have any questions. There was widespread use of ISO 55000. What do you think what impact would that have on disasters?
First of all, I like to go through what's the current requirements essentially by law. And that is that companies should have internal controls. And those internal controls actually essentially occurred, with internal controls over financial reporting, which started in 1934. 2013, the CASO organization, which is from folks from leading accounting organizations, had internal controls over financial reporting, but also effective efficient operations and compliance with laws and regulations. And so if they actually took, and part of that is also protection of assets. So if companies work what's required right now, that puts a long way to what should occur with assets, because assets management sit on top of that.
Excellent.
So, part of that overall process.
So Steve Holland is wondering if you think that federal agencies directors have the appetite for addressing asset management from a strategic perspective in a strategic asset management plan. And do you think they are even aware of what a SAMP is?
Well, what happens with, okay, let's deal with the Department of Defense property. Under FAR 45, point, I think it's 102, under solicitation, it requires plans and standards of which are used and best practices that are applicable to that particular contract. So the government is very, very much aware of plans and requirements for that. Also, like for DOD, for example, they under their internal procedure, which is 5000.64 on how to manage personal property, that also applies to ASTM 2279, which is the ASTM standard of how to manage property of the guiding principles. Now, I may have said, for example, I may have used the word SAMP, but that SAMP means Strategic Asset Management Plan. And in those plans, we've been again, ASTM 2279 was issued in like 2013. And those plans have been required for a long time, and which came before ISO 55000. So I think that the use of plans has pretty well has been accepted for a long time. The question is, are they broad enough and are they used enough to make it work?
You've answered the technical question. Now I want a one-word answer before we wind up. Do they have the appetite? It's an emotional, it's a cultural thing. Are they ready for it? Are the feds ready for ISO 55000?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I think they are. I think there's enough evidence.
I think that is seeing increased awareness through RFPs that require ISO 55000. So thanks, Steve, for that question. It lets us end on a hopeful note. I'd like to thank Rich for taking time to chat with us. And if we could have our sponsors and our organizational members posted, we would really like to thank them for making this type of activity possible. And thank you all for attending. Next week, Jim Dieter will be talking with Jack Dempsey. So we'll continue some in-depth chats about ISO 55000. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, appreciate it.